All right, hello everybody. Just like we have done a review of common errors in the PAiCE pre-fill, we are doing the same for common errors in the workshop data collection process. So we're starting here with AC. Mackenzie?
So the first thing which has actually changed is that you're now able to fill out each module two ways. So what it used to be is that you had to start with adaptation number one and then go through modules AC, AI, AS, AR, AP, AH, and AU in order to unlock the second adaptation in AC. That is no longer the case. So now, instead of having to fill row by row, you can fill down as well. So you could fill out adaptation number 1 and 2 in module AC and then move to AS. So you could potentially go module by module as opposed to adaptation by adaptation. You can do both, so it's really up to you and how you think it'll work best.
The important thing is that once you nominate something in your list and add data, don't change that because the data is aligned to there. So you can keep adding below, but never change the order or reselect something once it's selected there. The other thing is the reason why we were encouraging people to go line finish to the end on one adaptation and come back and start again is that if your workshop is running long, if you have gone line by line, it means that you might have a certain number of adaptations completed. If you go module by module and you only get to AH and you can't finish, it means the whole tool is incomplete. So do what's right for your workshop, but there is an advantage in completing one adaptation through the tool completely, coming back and starting a second rather than going module by module.
Yes. The other thing to keep in mind is when you're answering these questions, make sure that you have the discussion at each stage to make sure that you're answering correctly. We've developed a review process which will go through each answer for each adaptation. So if we find answers that we don't really understand, then we will ask you to justify them. And it'll be better for you to have those answers already written down through the workshops or just in the back of your mind so that you're ready to answer our review questions.
Part of the facilitator's role is to have their notebook out and write down some notes because, for instance, if there is a uptake of a short duration variety and it's listed as very difficult, we're going to come back to you and ask what could be so difficult about a varietal change.
Yes. The last thing is that for some of these workshops, we're getting very similar answers across the board. So that's, again, just with the review process. We will be asking, for instance, are all farmers really so open to all of these adaptation strategies? So again, just make sure you have that conversation and keep in mind that if all of the adaptation strategies are assessed the same way, then the tool won't be able to differentiate between them and give you the best ones.
And that may be the case, it's just very unlikely. But let's just say that you had done 7 adaptations and they were all easy. Think about, is there one of these that is a little bit more difficult than the others? Just so we can start to see some differentiation in what's happening there. In terms of the questions and interpretation of the questions, the third question here is around the use of scarce labor, and we're specifically wondering about farm labor in this example. So does it require you to get farm labor, either family farm or casual laborers, to implement the adaptation that you probably can't find? The fourth question is the requirement of new skills to adopt, and that's specifically of the farm owner, the farmer. Do they need some new piece of knowledge in order to do it correctly? The sixth question here is around the cost of the adaptation in a once-off initial investment, not seasonal costs. So what are some of the examples here? Changing irrigation scheduling, where you have to pay for water each season, is not an upfront cost. But buying a pump set at the start of your adaptation and then using it for 10 years is an upfront cost. The same with zero tillage. If you are using a service provider, you are not buying a tractor, then that does not have an upfront cost. However, if you need to buy a tractor, you need to buy a zero-till implement at the start and then use it for 10 years, that's an upfront cost. So if you're changing a fertilizer regime, that's not an upfront cost because you're buying fertilizer each season. So make sure when you're thinking about this, just as a discussion, do you need to buy a tractor? Do you need to buy a pump? Do you need to buy something expensive at the start that then you use for several years? That's what we're trying to capture here. The actual seasonal costs are captured later on. And finally, when we come to the community context, there's a question on the maximum rate of adoption. Now, the default would be 100%, and then think about, are there certain elements of this production domain that could never do this? It's not that just won't do this, it's that could never do this. So for example, if your adaptation is irrigation scheduling, there is 30% of farmers that are not in an irrigation scheme. That would mean that the maximum adoption rate is 70%. It doesn't matter if other parts of the irrigation scheme are never going to change because they have to do certain practices or whatnot. It's what proportion could never ever do this under any circumstances, not what do we expect the maximum rate to be. That's our common mistakes in Module AC. As always, think about and take notes so that you can justify these when we go into review. All right, there's less problems here in Module AI, implications. The main thing that you want to consider here is that the default for nearly all of these should be the neutral. So the no change, no relationship, or neutral. In this example, we can see that every single one of the 12 adaptations looked at improved sustainability. So it's an example where it's all the same and it's all positive. But also, is it likely that that's the case? So when we see anything that's not neutral here, we're probably going to ask you to justify it. So it's really good as a facilitator to be making sure you take notes on why the discussion led to the conclusion that it improved sustainability, or it was gender positive for women and girls, or for your marginalized population.
All right, so now we're looking at Module AS. So that starts off with how proven is the adaptation across the production domain. So this relates directly back to Module AC, to the percentages of the levels of current adoption. So if you have low levels of current adoption, it is unlikely that your adaptation will have been widely tested on farms. Alternatively, if you have a large amount of current adoption, it's likely that it will have already been tested on farms. So just make sure that there's some consistency between those two data points.
The next question is around the status of scaling plans. So this question is really trying to ask, in the next 5 years, what do you expect to happen? Is it just going to happen? There's no major issues, or are there some known bottlenecks that are going to occur along the way? If you nominate that there are bottlenecks, be prepared that we're going to ask you to tell us what those bottlenecks are. So have in your notebook, bottlenecks for this variety or bottlenecks for this practice are this. Moving on, we then have the government context. This is a 5-point scale. The importance here is if the government support it, we really want to know, is it just in principle, or are they providing active financial or extension programs to support it? So there might be that reduced tillage is in principle supported in policy. The government wants farmers to till less, but they're not actually telling the extension system to promote that, or they're not subsidizing zero-till equipment in any way. So think about, if the government is supporting that, is it actually putting something into that, or is it just that the policy supports it, but they're not acting on that? Importantly, if you choose that government supports it already, it won't ask you how important that is. You can just leave it blank because it doesn't matter if it's important or not. The government is already doing it.
If there is a box that does not have does not want you to fill it out, just don't fill it out.
If it's yellow with red text, it means you've got to put data in. If it's blank for a reason.
Last one in this module, in the private sector context, we talk about the markets. So the default for this one should be a market is a necessary requirement. If you are buying or selling anything for this adaptation to be taken up, then it will be a necessary requirement. There are very few situations where it would be not important or just helpful. Yeah.
So an example would be if the change is changing where the buns are on your farm and you're not importing any labor or anything, you're just doing it yourself, then that's an example where there is no market. An example that's not needed would be if you are using the own manure from your own cows, composting it and putting it back on the fields yourself. You're not engaging outside of your farm for anything, either to buy in or to sell off. The moment that you're selling that manure to another farmer, then it needs a market. All varieties need a market to buy. All service equipment. So if you're renting a zero-till drill from somebody, that's a market that's needed. So the default really is that you will need a market for most of these. In Module AR, what we're really encouraging groups to think about in the workshop is direct relationships. Indirect relationships that have very low impact on yield or changing costs really are probably not worth the effort of entering into the tool, because every time you say yes, you're going to then have to enter that data in AP or AH. The direct relationship should relate to either a change in yield or a change in cost of production or a change in income. And we want it to be fairly sizable in order to justify the time it takes to enter this into the tool. Whenever you put these answers in, remember that in the review process, we might come back to you and say, are you sure you've got this right? And where an answer changes, particularly from no to yes, it means we need more data, and you'll need to go back to get that data in order to complete the tool. So it's less important if we change something from yes to no, but it's really time consuming to change something from no to yes, because it means you need to collect more data. So think about direct relationships that change yield, cost of production, or income. The other thing is, it's really unlikely that an adaptation would address all 10 production constraints or all 10 climate hazards, because it would just mean that it's a silver bullet that solves everything. So in cases where you think that it does actually go across all of the challenges, think about, are they direct relationships as well? Because it is really unlikely. It might be possible, but it's really, really unlikely. In the case where you've got no across every single example, you will get a little reminder on the right that says no issues are addressed. Are you sure? So it may be the case that it doesn't address the top 10 production constraints or climate hazards. It just means that the tool is no longer interested in that because it's not solving the key constraints that we're trying to solve for.
Now we're moving on to module AP. And the first thing that we want to look at here is the yields. So we've actually calculated for you what the yields will be without the adaptations with each severity of production constraint. All that you need to do is think about how the adaptation strategy will improve the yield. Couple things to keep in mind while you're doing this. The first of which is that your yield might not actually be affected by the adaptation. The adaptation might focus on changing the annual costs of production or the income streams. The other thing to keep in mind is that for some of these adaptation strategies, they will affect or they will fully address the production constraint at each severity. So an example of this is that if the constraint is the unavailability of a harvest machinery and the adaptation is buying more machinery for this area to use, then at each constraint, in a non-impact area, in a mild impact area, moderate, and so on, the benefits will be the same. So you will put the same number across the board.
So in that example, if the yield without in areas that are not impacted by a lack of harvest equipment, the yield was 7.7 tons per hectare, and you can see that it has an impact each time. What we're saying is if the adaptation completely addresses a shortage of machinery, then that would become 7.7, and all of these would still be 7.7 because it's completely addressed it. Even though the yield without adaptation keeps going down in each of these, it directly addresses it. That number would be the same across the line. The other two elements that we're asking each time are around the change in costs and other income. And there seems to be a little bit of confusion around what this means. So let's look at income first. The reason why this is here is that in the case of a diversification of crop, you are removing one crop and you are adding another. We've asked about yield of adaptation. So in the case of a swapping of a primary crop, the yield then becomes zero because you are no longer cropping maize. If you're substituting maize for cowpea, the yield with adaptation is 0 tons per hectare of maize. But your income goes up by the production of your chickpea or your whatever your second crop is. So you'd have to do some math and say chickpea sells for 500 tons dollars per ton, and it yields 3 tons. So we have an additional income of $1,500. So the yield with adaptation is the yield of the crop that's actually listed. So winter wheat or summer maize. Income is really only relevant to the crop diversification options. It's not relevant. Your income doesn't change for nearly every other type of adaptation. So most of the time that's going to be zero. You really only consider it for the diversification options. In terms of the costs of production, this is directly related to how much money are you spending to make this adaptation work. So for instance, it can be positive or negative. If it is smart fertilizing and that uses less fertilizer, you would actually be a negative number because you're buying less fertilizer. If it's intensification of fertilizer use, you're buying more fertilizer, then it might increase your costs. So it can be negative, it can be positive. If you're changing tillage regimes from 5 rounds of tillage to 1 round of tillage, that's likely to be a negative number. And in this case, negative means less. So if it turns green, it's good. If it turns red, it's more. So think about, are you entering the right way? Is it increasing costs, i.e. red, or is it decreasing costs, i.e. green? Similar to what we saw in AP, we are using the same question set in AH, but there are some slight differences. For instance, we can't know the type of year that will occur for the next 10 years. So our investment or the change in cost of production is essentially before the fact. It doesn't change by year. So that's now only asked once, not for each type of year. Remembering it can be zero, no change in cost of production, or it can be negative or positive based on if it's costing you more or less to use that adaptation compared to current practice.
So for yield in this one, it's slightly different to the previous module because you can actually have a yield with adaptation, which is slightly lower than the yield without adaptation. So for instance, if the adaptation strategy is the uptake of a drought-tolerant variety, this might decrease the yield in a non-event year, but help to combat the climate change challenge in mild to very heavy impact years.
And likewise with income, remember it's really only relevant to the swapping out of a different crop, but you're going to have to do the math there and say the yield would go to zero if we're not doing a particular crop, and whatever the value of production is of that new crop in terms of income that would need to be put there. Remembering that you also have to consider the costs of doing crop 1 versus crop 2 in the costs of production. So those are likely to be quite different numbers as well. So finally in Module AU, what we really want is to identify the research questions. And that's because Excellence in Agronomy is a research for development program. And if something is coming out as the best bet prioritization to invest in, to move forward with, we really would like to already have a short list of the key things that need to be resolved before that can move ahead. So here's an example where it's pretty unlikely that there's just no research questions or no other notes. So please use this, please have the discussion. I know it's at the end of your workshop where people are starting to fatigue and everything, but it's also an opportunity for people to feed directly into the strategy moving forward and the research agenda moving forward. We know that there are going to be data gaps for every single thing. Let's identify them now and really encourage the participants to have that discussion about what are the top 3 research questions that are remaining. As we then move on, something that we've noted is that very rarely are any of these filters used. So it's something maybe that's less useful in the workshop context, but these files will be sent to respondents for their organizations where those respondents can then say that they are not interested in maize and to exclude it. So maybe just show them in the workshop that that functionality is there if you don't wish to use it. The other thing is the weightings. Nearly always these weightings are left the same as the defaults, but please do have that discussion in your workshop to say, are we happy with these weightings? Is it the economic benefit should be worth 55% of the total score, or is that too high or too low? Usually, we would not put equal weightings to each of the support needs, the implications, and the farmer adoptability. Remembering, farmer adoptability is everything in AC, implications is everything in AI, and support needs is everything in AS, and then the economics is the AP, AH. So that's where they relate to. So just let people know, but please do play around with those numbers. You can play around with them and see everything changes. So for instance, if we change that to 30%, our whole list then changes. So play around in the workshop with it on the screen to see if the things that people value change via the workshop. You've got then this final set of numbers, but you also have the ability to print 2 types of reports. The first report is the full report. From memory, I think it's actually 16 pages long. So it's comprehensive. It's a summary of who was there around all of the data that's gone through the tools, around uncertainties, and a summary. You also now have a brief report, which is only 2 pages. It doesn't have definitions or anything. It's just got basically 3 key graphs that come through.